In the heart of a small coastal town, hidden along a stretch of sandy shores and lined with aging oaks, lived a community so tightly woven that secrets had little room to grow. This town, once vibrant and brimming with life, had now settled into a rhythm of predictability. Every person had their place, every face was familiar, and every whisper carried from one end of the town to the other. The people who lived here found comfort in the quiet, in the absence of major scandals or disruptions to their daily lives. Salisbury, as it was called, was a place where traditions were upheld and reputations mattered. A place where everyone knew your story, or at least they thought they did. The small clinic where Lydia worked as a nurse was the cornerstone of this peaceful town. Nestled between the town hall and the old church, it had stood for decades, witnessing the lives of multiple generations. The building itself, though weathered by the salty air, was well maintained, with white painted bricks and a dark wooden roof that gave it a homely feel. It was a place of healing and safety, a refuge for the sick, the vulnerable, and the lonely. And at the center of it all was Lydia, a woman who had become as much a part of the town's fabric as the church bells that chimed every Sunday morning. Lydia was in her early 40s, tall and graceful, with a serene demeanor that made her seem ageless. Her presence exuded warmth and calm, a soothing balm to the anxieties and ailments of those who passed through the clinic's doors. Her reputation as a competent and caring nurse was unmatched. She had treated nearly every resident in town at some point, and her patient list stretched far beyond the confines of Salisbury. Lydia's life, outwardly simple, revolved around her work. She had been a widow for many years, after her husband's sudden death in an accident, and though she wore the mantle of grief with dignity, her loneliness was a shadow that clung to her every step. The townsfolk adored Lydia, often seeing her as more than just a nurse. She was a friend to some, a surrogate mother to others, and a beacon of reliability. In many ways, she was the glue that held the small community together, listening to their stories, soothing their worries, and offering both comfort and care. But despite this admiration, Lydia was a woman of mystery. Few knew much about her personal life beyond her work at the clinic. She had no children, no close family, and her social life was limited to brief interactions at the market or the church. When she wasn't at the clinic, she retreated to her modest home near the edge of town, where she lived alone, surrounded only by her late husband's belongings and the memories they stirred. It was this solitude, this quiet life, that eventually became unbearable for Lydia. The years had worn her down, and while she was excellent at hiding it, she longed for something more. Her work, once a source of fulfillment, began to feel like a routine. The daily parade of illnesses and injuries no longer stirred in her the satisfaction it once had. Instead, it reminded her of everything she had lost and everything she would never have: a family, passion, and the companionship she had once taken for granted. The emptiness of her home echoed in her mind every night, and though she remained professional, something within her began to shift. This internal shift coincided with the arrival of a series of younger male patients, all of whom entered her life in different ways, but with the same magnetic pull. These men, much younger than her, represented the vibrancy and excitement Lydia had long since buried under her layers of grief and professionalism. Each of them came to her in need, and in her desire to heal them, she found herself drawn into something much darker and more complex than she had anticipated. What began as simple nurse-patient relationships morphed into entanglements of a different sort: emotional, passionate, and dangerously consuming. The first to arrive was Io, a 30-year-old fitness trainer, muscular and full of life. He had come to the clinic after a severe injury that required months of rehabilitation. His body, once the source of his confidence and livelihood, had betrayed him, and he struggled to cope with the sudden limitations imposed on him. Lydia was assigned to help with his recovery, and as the weeks passed, they grew closer. Io was charming, flirtatious, and brimming with energy, a stark contrast to the men in Lydia's age group. His youthful confidence was intoxicating, and before long, Lydia found herself responding to his advances. He filled a void in her life that she hadn't realized was so gaping, and in return, she became more than just his nurse. She became his emotional anchor, his secret lover. But Io was not the only one to fall under Lydia's care, or her spell. Shortly after, a patient named Daniel began his treatment at the clinic. He was 25, quiet and troubled, battling severe anxiety and depression. Unlike Io, whose approach was all passion and desire, Daniel was soft-spoken, vulnerable, and in desperate need of someone to lean on. Lydia, seeing his fragility, felt a maternal instinct awaken within her. She spent extra time with him, offering not just medical advice but emotional support, blurring the boundaries of their professional relationship. Daniel, too, began to depend on her in ways that went far beyond the clinic. His calls and visits became more frequent, and though Lydia knew it was unhealthy, she couldn't bring herself to turn him away. Next came Kofi, an aspiring artist whose erratic personality both fascinated and unnerved Lydia. At 28, Kofi was a creative soul, volatile and unpredictable, prone to mood swings that ranged from explosive anger to deep melancholy. He came to Lydia for help managing his mental health, which had been deteriorating under the pressure of his struggling art career. There was something about his intensity, his raw emotion, that drew Lydia in, despite her better judgment. She knew Kofi was dangerous not in the physical sense, but emotionally. Yet she was captivated by his passion, something she had not felt in years. Their relationship teetered on the edge of professional and personal, and Lydia felt herself slipping into something she couldn't control. Then there was Emeka, a 27-year-old man recovering from a long battle with addiction. His time in rehab had left him physically weakened and emotionally shattered, and Lydia became his guide in his journey to sobriety. Emeka was fragile, easily broken, and he clung to Lydia for stability. He saw her as his savior, and the weight of that responsibility slowly crushed her. Like the others, Emeka's dependence on Lydia grew into something more than just medical. His vulnerability became seductive to her, as she saw herself as the only one who could truly help him. Finally, there was Kwame, the youngest of her patients at 23. Quiet, introverted, and deeply introspective, Kwame was different from the others. He didn't demand Lydia's attention outright, but his silent affection for her was palpable. He worshipped her from afar, his admiration bordering on obsession. Lydia, though flattered, didn't initially see him as a threat. But as time passed, his jealousy of the other men became more apparent, and his need for her attention turned into something much darker. In the quiet confines of this small town, Lydia's life spiraled out of control. What had started as a desire to fill the emotional void in her life had become a dangerous game of emotional manipulation, obsession, and jealousy. She was no longer in control, and the boundaries she had once maintained between her personal and professional life had dissolved completely. These 5 men, each with their own needs and desires, had become intertwined in a web of secrets and lies. And in this town, where secrets were never kept for long, it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled, and when it did, the consequences would be fatal. Lydia was the kind of woman who commanded both admiration and respect, though she never sought it out. In the small coastal town of Salisbury, her presence was one of quiet authority, a woman known for her dedication and calm demeanor. She was the steady hand that had guided countless patients through illness and recovery, the nurse who was trusted without question. Her reputation, built over years of hard work and empathy, was impeccable. To the people of Salisbury, Lydia was more than just a nurse. She was a symbol of the town's heart, someone who was always there when they needed her. But beneath the surface, Lydia was much more complex than the simple, almost saintly figure her patients believed her to be. She had always been reserved, preferring to keep her personal life hidden from the watchful eyes of the town. At 42, she had spent nearly half her life in the profession, and though she loved the work, the long hours and constant emotional demands had taken their toll on her. Her days followed a routine. She woke early, drank her coffee in solitude, then drove the short distance to the clinic, where she would spend hours tending to the town's sick, injured, and vulnerable. When the day ended, she would return to her small, quiet home at the edge of town, a place that echoed with the memories of the life she once had but could never reclaim. Lydia's husband, David, had been the love of her life. Their marriage had been a happy one, filled with laughter and warmth. But that all came to a tragic end 10 years ago when David was killed in a car accident on a stormy night. The loss had been devastating. For months, Lydia had struggled to cope with the void his death left in her life. Her grief was deep, but it was private. She had learned to hide it well, a skill that served her both in her work and in her daily interactions with the people of Salisbury. To the outside world, Lydia had moved on. She was the picture of resilience, a woman who had suffered but refused to let it break her. But inside, the loneliness lingered like a dull ache that never truly went away. In the years following David's death, Lydia's life had become increasingly insular. She had no children to comfort her, no close family to lean on. She buried herself in her work, allowing it to consume her entirely. It was easier that way, easier than confronting the emptiness that awaited her at home. Her house, once filled with the warmth of shared meals and conversations with David, had become a cold and quiet place. The rooms, though tidy and well-kept, were devoid of life. Every corner held a memory, and those memories weighed heavily on her. Despite this, Lydia had never allowed herself to wallow in her sadness. She had responsibilities to her patients, to the clinic, to the town. She carried on, as she always had, with grace and professionalism. But as the years passed, Lydia found herself longing for something more. She wasn't sure what it was exactly: companionship, perhaps, or the thrill of feeling alive again. The respect she commanded in the town was comforting, but it wasn't enough to fill the emotional void. The routine she had built for herself was secure, but it had grown suffocating. At night, when she was alone in her house, the silence became unbearable. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, these were the only sounds that accompanied her as she sat in her living room, reading books or staring at the television without really watching. Sometimes she would pour herself a glass of wine, hoping it would ease the loneliness, but it never did. The wine only dulled her senses, leaving her more aware of the vast emptiness that had become her life. On those nights, Lydia found herself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was all there was for her now. It wasn't that she didn't have suitors. Even in her early 40s, Lydia was still a striking woman. Her dark hair, which she wore tied back in a loose bun during her shifts, framed a face that had aged gracefully. Her eyes, though often tired, still sparkled with intelligence and warmth, and her smile, when it appeared, was soft but genuine. She had never been one for makeup or flashy clothes, preferring the simplicity of scrubs and comfortable shoes. Yet there was a natural beauty to her, one that hadn't gone unnoticed by some of the men in town. But Lydia had never entertained their advances. She couldn't imagine herself with anyone other than David, even after all these years. And so she remained alone, devoted to her work, trusted and admired by all. But as time went on, that devotion became a double-edged sword. The satisfaction Lydia once derived from helping her patients began to feel hollow. The routine she had relied on for so long no longer brought her comfort. Each day blurred into the next, and though she kept a calm exterior, inside she was unraveling. Lydia began to question the choices she had made, the life she had built for herself after David's death. Was this truly enough for her? Was this all she could expect from the rest of her days? It was in this state of emotional turmoil that Lydia met Io, the first of the 5 men who had come to change her life in ways she could never have anticipated. Io was unlike anyone Lydia had ever encountered. He was full of life, energetic and confident, a stark contrast to the older men she had been used to treating. When he came to the clinic with a severe shoulder injury, she was immediately struck by his charm. He flirted with her in a way that was playful but not overbearing, and for the first time in years, Lydia found herself responding. She felt alive again, and though she knew it was dangerous, she couldn't resist the pull. Io was just the beginning. Soon after, Daniel appeared quiet, vulnerable, and deeply troubled. His mental health issues required a different kind of care, and Lydia found herself drawn to his fragility. He needed her in a way that no one else did, and that need awakened something in her. She began to spend more time with him, offering him emotional support that went beyond her duties as a nurse. It was a slippery slope, but once she started down it, she found it hard to stop. Next came Kofi, then Emeka, and finally Kwame. Each man, though different in temperament and need, filled a gap in Lydia's life. Io brought excitement, Daniel brought emotional connection, Kofi brought intensity, Emeka brought vulnerability, and Kwame brought admiration. Together, they created a whirlwind of emotions that Lydia hadn't experienced in years. It was thrilling and dangerous, intoxicating and exhausting. She was no longer just a nurse, she was a lover, a confidant, a savior. But as these relationships deepened, Lydia began to lose control. What had started as a way to fill the void in her life quickly spiraled into something much darker. Each man demanded more of her time, more of her attention, and she found it increasingly difficult to manage the delicate balance between her personal desires and her professional responsibilities. The lines between nurse and lover, between care and manipulation, blurred beyond recognition. And though she tried to convince herself that she was still in control, that she could keep these relationships separate, deep down Lydia knew that she was heading toward disaster. In her pursuit of emotional connection, Lydia had entangled herself in a web of obsession, jealousy, and desperation. The men in her life, each with their own needs and insecurities, were pulling her in different directions. Io's possessiveness, Daniel's dependence, Kofi's volatility, Emeka's instability, and Kwame's growing jealousy, all of it was converging into something she couldn't untangle. And as the pressure mounted, Lydia found herself trapped, a victim of her own choices, spiraling toward an inevitable and tragic end. Though she had spent her life caring for others, in the end, Lydia could not save herself. The role she had so carefully crafted, nurse, healer, lover, began to collapse under the weight of her secret desires. The very things that had once brought her a sense of purpose and connection now became the sources of her undoing. And in the quiet, suffocating town of Salisbury, where every secret eventually came to light, Lydia's carefully constructed life was about to unravel in the most devastating way possible. Each of the 5 men who became entangled in Lydia's life arrived at different points, but all were drawn to her by a combination of emotional need and her nurturing presence. They came to her as patients, seeking medical help, yet each man found in Lydia something more, something they craved but had been unable to find elsewhere. To Lydia, they represented different facets of a life she had long since buried: passion, companionship, intensity, and the desire to feel needed. However, these relationships, which started as professional, quickly crossed dangerous lines. The first man was Io, a 30-year-old fitness trainer whose body was his livelihood. Tall, muscular, and charismatic, Io was a man who had lived his life defined by his physical prowess. But after a gym accident left him with a serious shoulder injury, he found himself lost and frustrated, unable to work and unsure of how to move forward. Io was used to being the center of attention, admired by others for his athleticism and charm, but his injury had left him feeling vulnerable for the first time in his adult life. When he first came to Lydia's clinic, he was desperate for help, both physically and emotionally. Lydia's calm and capable demeanor immediately attracted him. She provided him with the care he needed, and through his rehabilitation, they grew closer. Io, accustomed to getting what he wanted, quickly turned his charm on Lydia, drawing her into his orbit. For Lydia, who had been starved of attention and affection for years, Io's attention was intoxicating. He made her feel alive again, desired in ways she hadn't felt since her husband's death. But Io's charm had a darker side. He was possessive, demanding more and more of Lydia's time and attention as their relationship deepened. He craved control, and when Lydia's attention shifted to her other patients, Io's jealousy began to surface. His need to dominate every aspect of her life became overwhelming, and though Lydia initially enjoyed the excitement he brought, she soon found herself suffocating under the weight of his demands. While Io represented physical passion and control, Daniel was the opposite. At 25, Daniel was a quiet, introspective man, weighed down by severe depression and anxiety. He had been a patient of Lydia's for a few months before their relationship took a personal turn. Daniel was fragile, his mental health precarious, and he found in Lydia the maternal care he had been longing for. She became his lifeline, the one person he could trust to understand his inner turmoil. For Lydia, Daniel awakened a sense of protectiveness. She saw in him a broken soul, someone she could fix, someone who needed her in a way that no one else did. Daniel's emotional vulnerability fed into her desire to feel needed, to be someone's anchor in a storm. The more time they spent together, the more dependent Daniel became on her. His phone calls grew more frequent, often late at night, his anxiety manifesting in desperate pleas for her attention. Lydia, unable to resist the pull of his dependence, allowed their relationship to cross the boundaries of professionalism. What had started as a nurse-patient relationship became something much more complicated, an emotional entanglement that neither of them could fully control. As Lydia juggled Io's possessiveness and Daniel's dependence, a new figure entered her life: Kofi, a 28-year-old aspiring artist with a volatile temperament. Kofi was different from the others. His emotional state was unpredictable, swinging between intense passion and sudden bursts of anger. His art reflected this instability, dark, moody, and often violent in its expression. He came to Lydia seeking help for his mental health, struggling to cope with the pressures of his failing art career and the emotional toll it had taken on him. Lydia was both fascinated and unnerved by Kofi. There was a raw energy to him that she found captivating, a creative spirit that drew her in despite the obvious risks. He was unlike anyone she had encountered before: intense, passionate, and at times frightening. Kofi's moods shifted unpredictably, and Lydia often found herself walking on eggshells around him, unsure of when his temper might flare. Yet, despite this, she couldn't stay away. There was something about his intensity that made her feel alive in ways she hadn't in years. It was a dangerous attraction, one that Lydia knew could spiral out of control, but she was powerless to resist it. While Kofi represented a chaotic force in her life, Emeka, a 27-year-old recovering addict, brought with him a different kind of vulnerability. Emeka had spent years battling his addiction, and though he had managed to get clean, the emotional scars of his past still haunted him. He came to Lydia seeking both physical and emotional healing, and she, in turn, provided him with the stability he desperately needed. Emeka saw Lydia as his savior, someone who had helped him through the darkest moments of his life. His gratitude for her care quickly turned into something more, a deep emotional attachment that he couldn't shake. For Lydia, Emeka's vulnerability was appealing. She felt needed in a way that she hadn't in years, and though she knew it was unhealthy, she couldn't bring herself to distance herself from him. Emeka's neediness was different from Daniel's. It was rooted in his trauma, his fear of slipping back into his old ways. Lydia became the center of his world, the one person he believed could keep him on the right path. But as his dependence on her grew, so did Lydia's realization that she was in over her head. The final patient to enter Lydia's life was Kwame, the youngest of the five at 23. Quiet, reserved, and deeply introspective, Kwame was initially one of Lydia's more straightforward patients. He came to the clinic for routine checkups, and though their relationship started off entirely professional, something in Kwame's demeanor changed over time. His admiration for Lydia grew into something more, something deeper. He watched her with a quiet intensity, his feelings for her simmering just beneath the surface. Kwame's affection for Lydia was pure, at least at first. He respected her, looked up to her, and in many ways idolized her. But as he became aware of the attention she was giving to the other men in her life, his feelings of admiration turned to jealousy. Unlike Ayo's possessive anger or Daniel's emotional neediness, Kwame's jealousy was subtle, simmering in the background. He never confronted Lydia directly, but his silent resentment grew with each passing day. The more time Lydia spent with the others, the more Kwame felt pushed aside, and his quiet affection began to warp into something darker. Each of these men, Ayo, Daniel, Kofi, Emeka, and Kwame, came to Lydia with their own needs and desires, and in trying to meet those needs, Lydia lost herself. What had started as an attempt to fill the emotional void in her life spiraled into a tangled web of obsession, jealousy, and emotional manipulation. Lydia had crossed lines she never should have, allowing herself to become deeply entangled in the lives of these five men. Now, she found herself struggling to maintain control, but with each passing day, the weight of their demands grew heavier. Unbeknownst to Lydia, this delicate balance she was trying to maintain was already beginning to crack, and the consequences of her actions would soon come crashing down around her. As Lydia became more entangled with each of the five men, the delicate balance she had tried to maintain between her professional life and personal desires began to unravel. At first, she had convinced herself that she could manage it all, that her relationships with Ayo, Daniel, Kofi, Emeka, and Kwame could coexist without consequence. But the deeper she ventured into each man's world, the more apparent it became that this web of connections was fraught with danger, and the tension between the men started to build beneath the surface, invisible but ever present. Ayo, with his overpowering presence, was the first to sense that Lydia's attention was being divided. His possessiveness, once a source of excitement for her, grew darker. He began to demand more of her time, showing up at her clinic unannounced, expecting her to drop everything for him. What had once been flirtatious and thrilling turned into suffocating jealousy. Ayo's confidence had always bordered on arrogance, and now that Lydia was slipping from his control, his insecurity and anger surfaced. He began to question her about her interactions with other patients, particularly the younger men who also sought her attention. His visits, which had once brought Lydia a sense of excitement, now filled her with dread, as she knew each meeting would bring another round of accusations and suspicion. Daniel, in contrast, responded to the growing distance between him and Lydia with quiet desperation. His emotional dependence on her had only deepened over time, and now any perceived slight, a missed call, a canceled meeting, sent him spiraling into anxiety. He became more and more fragile, calling Lydia at all hours of the night, often in tears, begging for reassurance that she hadn't abandoned him. His neediness was overwhelming, and though Lydia cared for him, she began to feel trapped by his constant demands for attention and validation. She knew she should pull back, create boundaries, but every time she tried, Daniel's panic drew her back in. The guilt of abandoning him weighed heavily on her, but the emotional toll of his dependence was starting to erode her own mental state. Kofi's volatile nature only intensified as time went on. His relationship with Lydia was a storm of passion and unpredictability, and now, As he sensed her slipping away, his anger began to surface more frequently. His mood swings became more extreme. One moment he was affectionate, showering her with admiration and gratitude for helping him through his emotional turmoil. The next, he was angry, accusing her of using him, playing with his emotions. His art, already dark and intense, took on a more violent tone, reflecting the turmoil inside him. Lydia, who had once been drawn to his raw passion, now felt herself recoiling from his intensity. But she couldn't break free from the hold he had on her. Kofi's presence in her life was like a fire that burned too hot, consuming everything in its path, and yet, part of her was still drawn to the heat, unable to let go. Emeka's dependency on Lydia also grew more troubling. Though his addiction had been under control for some time, the emotional crutch he found in Lydia became unhealthy. He idolized her, seeing her not just as his nurse but as his savior, the one person who had pulled him out of the darkness. But as Lydia's attention became more divided, Emeka's sense of stability began to crumble. He started to exhibit signs of relapse, his anxiety about losing her triggering old habits. His visits to the clinic became less about his physical recovery and more about seeking reassurance from Lydia that she still cared for him. His emotional fragility put Lydia in a difficult position. She didn't want to abandon him in his time of need, but the burden of carrying his recovery on her shoulders became increasingly heavy. Meanwhile, Kwame, the quietest of the five, watched from the sidelines, his jealousy simmering beneath the surface. Unlike Ayo's overt possessiveness or Kofi's explosive anger, Kwame's jealousy was subtle, a slow burn that began to consume him. He had once idolized Lydia, seeing her as someone pure and untouchable, but as he realized she was involved with the other men, his feelings darkened. He kept his emotions bottled up, never confronting her directly, but his resentment grew with each passing day. He began to show up at the clinic more frequently, not to seek medical help, but simply to be near her, watching, waiting, hoping for a moment when she would give him the attention he craved. His quiet presence became unsettling, his eyes following her movements with an intensity that made her uneasy. As the weeks went on, the tension between the five men began to bubble to the surface. Ayo's confrontations became more aggressive, his jealousy turning into a possessive rage. He began to follow Lydia, showing up at her house unannounced, demanding to know where she had been and with whom. Daniel's emotional breakdowns grew more frequent and intense, his dependence on Lydia reaching a point where he could no longer function without her constant reassurance. Kofi's temper flared more often, his mood swings leaving Lydia feeling as if she were walking on a razor's edge, never knowing when he might explode. Emeka, teetering on the edge of relapse, became increasingly erratic, while Kwame's quiet jealousy transformed into a brooding, silent obsession. Lydia, who had once believed she could keep these relationships separate, now found herself caught in the middle of a storm she could no longer control. Each man wanted more of her, and the more she tried to appease them, the more demanding they became. The boundaries between them collapsed, and the carefully constructed compartments of her life began to crumble. Lydia could feel the tension rising, a slow, insidious pressure building towards something inevitable. Every interaction felt charged, every glance laced with suspicion, jealousy, and desperation. The web she had woven was tightening around her, and she knew, deep down, that something was about to break. The night of Lydia's murder began like many others, shrouded in the quiet stillness of Salisbury. The town, as always, was peaceful on the surface, its streets empty, its residents settled into their routines. But in Lydia's world, beneath the veneer of calm, a storm had been building for weeks. She had spent the day trying to maintain the fragile balance between the five men in her life, each of them pulling her in different directions. The tension, which had been slowly tightening around her, was now a palpable force, suffocating her every move. She knew something was about to give, but she hadn't expected the violence that would come. Lydia had been avoiding Ayo's calls all day. His possessiveness had reached new heights, and she couldn't bear another confrontation. He had been growing more aggressive, demanding explanations for her every absence, every moment she spent with someone else. But Ayo wasn't the only one. Daniel had been calling her relentlessly too, his messages filled with desperation. His anxiety had spiraled out of control, and she had become his sole lifeline. Emeka had come by the clinic earlier, looking pale and shaky, a sign that he was teetering on the edge of a relapse. Even Kofi had shown up unexpectedly, his mood dark and brooding, leaving Lydia feeling unnerved. Kwame had been the only one who hadn't made contact, but she knew his quiet, simmering jealousy was no less dangerous. As evening fell, Lydia retreated to her home, hoping for a moment of peace. But the isolation only intensified her fear. Her house, once a place of refuge, felt like a trap now. She moved from room to room, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. She knew the men in her life were growing restless, and their patience was running thin. Lydia's phone buzzed again, another message from Daniel, this time more frantic than before. She ignored it, her hands trembling as she placed the phone face down on the kitchen table. She needed space, time to think, to figure out how to untangle herself from the mess she had created. But deep down, Lydia knew it was too late. It was nearing midnight when the knock came at the door. It was forceful, demanding unmistakably Io. Her heart raced as she stood frozen, staring at the door. She had been dreading this confrontation all day, but now it was unavoidable. She knew he wouldn't leave until she faced him. Bracing herself, Lydia opened the door to find Io standing there, his face twisted in anger. Without a word, he pushed past her and into the house, his presence filling the room with a suffocating tension. He began questioning her immediately, his voice low and dangerous, demanding to know where she had been, who she had been with. Lydia tried to calm him, tried to reason with him, but Io was beyond reason. His possessiveness had turned into fury, and his words grew more heated with each passing moment. The argument escalated quickly, Io's voice rising as he accused her of betrayal. Lydia's attempts to placate him only fueled his anger. He moved closer, his physical presence overwhelming, and for the first time Lydia felt real fear in his presence. She had seen flashes of this anger before, but never like this. Io wasn't just angry, he was unhinged, and the fury in his eyes told her that this was no longer just about jealousy. It was about control, about ownership. He believed he owned her, and in his mind she had broken that unspoken agreement by dividing her attention among the other men. As the confrontation intensified, Lydia didn't hear the second knock at the door. It wasn't until Daniel appeared in the doorway that she realized someone else had come. His face was pale, his hands shaking, his entire body radiating the kind of nervous energy that always preceded one of his panic attacks. He had come for reassurance, for comfort, but what he found instead was Io, towering over Lydia, his rage filling the small space. Daniel's eyes flicked between Lydia and Io, his confusion quickly turning to fear, and then to something darker. He had always been fragile, emotionally unstable, but the sight of Lydia cornered by Io triggered something deep within him. Daniel's arrival only made things worse. Io, already enraged, now saw him as another rival, another man trying to take what was his. The room filled with a dangerous tension, thick with jealousy and possessiveness. Io turned his fury on Daniel, accusing him of being part of the reason Lydia was pulling away. Daniel, already on the edge, became frantic, his breathing shallow, his eyes wide with fear and desperation. Lydia could see the situation spiraling out of control, but before she could intervene, the confrontation exploded. Io lunged at Daniel, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him against the wall. The sound of the impact reverberated through the room, and for a moment Lydia was paralyzed with fear. She knew Io was strong, far stronger than Daniel, and she could see that Daniel was no match for him. But it wasn't just Io's strength that terrified her, it was the look in his eyes, the pure, unfiltered rage that had taken over him. This wasn't the man she had once been drawn to. This was someone else, someone dangerous. In the chaos that followed, Lydia tried to intervene, but her efforts were in vain. Io was consumed by his anger, and Daniel, cornered and terrified, fought back with a desperation that made him reckless. The struggle moved through the house, knocking over furniture and shattering the fragile peace that had once existed in Lydia's home. Io's rage was overwhelming, and Daniel, fueled by panic, lashed out blindly, trying to free himself from Io's grip. Lydia watched, helpless, as the two men spiraled into violence, each fueled by their own twisted version of love for her. It was only when Lydia stepped between them, trying to stop the fight, that the fatal blow was struck. In the confusion, Io pushed Daniel back with such force that he stumbled into Lydia, sending her crashing into the edge of the kitchen counter. The sound of her body hitting the hard surface was sharp, final. She crumpled to the ground, motionless, her eyes wide in shock. Both men froze, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like a heavy fog. Lydia lay still on the floor, her chest barely rising and falling, her breath shallow. The silence that followed was suffocating. Io and Daniel stood there, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. The rage that had filled the room moments before dissipated, replaced by a cold, sinking realization. Neither of them had meant for it to go this far. But now Lydia was dead, and there was no going back. In the aftermath, the two men fled the scene, leaving Lydia's lifeless body behind. The house, once her sanctuary, was now a crime scene, filled with the echoes of the violence that had ended her life. Lydia, who had spent years caring for others, who had tried to navigate the dangerous waters of her relationships with these men, was gone, the victim of the very chaos she had helped create. In the wake of Lydia's murder, Salisbury was gripped by shock and horror. The town, known for its quiet, tight-knit community, had never witnessed a crime of such magnitude. Lydia had been more than just a nurse to the people. She was a pillar of the community, a constant presence in their lives. Her death shattered the town's sense of safety, leaving behind an air of uncertainty and fear. Rumors swirled and suspicions ran high as the townspeople grappled with the knowledge that someone in their midst had taken her life. The discovery of Lydia's body came early the next morning when a concerned neighbor, noticing her absence from her usual morning routine, decided to check on her. The sight that greeted the neighbor upon entering Lydia's home was horrific. Lydia's body lay on the cold kitchen floor, her face pale and bruised, her lifeless form a stark contrast to the vibrant woman the town had known. The house itself was in disarray, furniture overturned, signs of a violent struggle clear in every room. The neighbor immediately called the police, and soon the quiet streets of Salisbury were filled with flashing lights and murmured conversations. The investigation into Lydia's murder began swiftly, with detectives combing through her home for evidence. It was clear from the state of the house that her death had not been an accident. There were too many signs of violence, too much evidence of a struggle. The police quickly realized that this was a crime of passion, driven by intense emotions rather than a random act of violence. The focus of the investigation turned toward the men in Lydia's life, all of whom had been seen at her clinic or around town, vying for her attention in the weeks leading up to her death. The first person to fall under suspicion was Io. His explosive temper and possessiveness were well known to those closest to Lydia, and he had made little effort to hide his jealousy in public. Several witnesses had reported seeing him at Lydia's house late at night on multiple occasions, and his behavior in the days leading up to the murder had been increasingly erratic. The police were able to track Io down within hours of discovering Lydia's body, and he was brought in for questioning. Io's initial reaction was one of defiance. He denied having any involvement in Lydia's death, claiming that their relationship, though tumultuous, had never crossed into physical violence. But as the interrogation continued, his anger began to show. He lashed out at the detectives, insisting that Lydia had been pulling away from him because of the other men in her life. His jealousy and resentment were clear, and it became evident to the investigators that Io had felt betrayed by Lydia's attention to the others. However, despite his volatile demeanor, Io continued to insist that he had not killed her. He admitted to being at Lydia's house the night before, but claimed that he had left after an argument, leaving her unharmed. While Io's aggression made him an obvious suspect, the investigation quickly uncovered other, more subtle dynamics at play. Daniel, whose emotional dependence on Lydia had been growing for months, was also brought in for questioning. Unlike Io, Daniel was fragile and nervous, his anxiety palpable during the interrogation. He admitted to being at Lydia's house on the night of her death, but was vague about the details. His hands shook as he spoke, and he struggled to maintain eye contact with the detectives. Daniel's desperation for Lydia's affection, combined with his fragile mental state, made him another prime suspect. The police couldn't ignore the possibility that Daniel, in a fit of jealousy or panic, had lashed out and accidentally killed her during a confrontation. Further complicating matters was the presence of Kofi, Emeka, and Kwame in Lydia's life. Kofi, with his volatile moods and unpredictable temper, had also been a frequent visitor to Lydia's home. His intense passion for her, combined with his creative frustrations and mental instability, made him another figure of interest. The police began to piece together the timeline of Lydia's last few days, realizing that Kofi had been at the clinic multiple times, each visit more erratic than the last. His dark, moody demeanor, combined with his history of emotional outbursts, made him a suspect who couldn't be overlooked. Emeka's role in the unfolding tragedy was also scrutinized. Though he had been in recovery for months, his emotional attachment to Lydia had bordered on obsessive. His gratitude for her help had evolved into a deep emotional dependence, and his fear of losing her had caused him to spiral. The police learned that Emeka had been seen near Lydia's house the day before her death, pacing nervously outside, though no one had witnessed him entering. His fragile state, combined with his history of addiction and emotional instability, made the investigators wonder if he had been capable of harming her in a moment of desperation. Kwame, though the youngest and quietest of the 5 men, was not above suspicion either. His quiet jealousy, simmering beneath the surface, had turned into a dangerous obsession. The investigators found that Kwame had been following Lydia's movements for weeks, watching her from a distance, never confronting her directly but growing increasingly resentful of the other men in her life. Though he had never acted out violently before, the police couldn't ignore the possibility that his jealousy had finally reached a breaking point. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Lydia's murder wasn't the result of a single person's actions but rather a culmination of all the emotional entanglements she had allowed to grow unchecked. The police began to suspect that the confrontation on the night of her death involved more than one of the men. Lydia's life had become a powder keg of jealousy, obsession, and emotional manipulation, and it was likely that the explosion of violence had been triggered by a confrontation between Io and Daniel, with Lydia caught in the middle. The forensic evidence began to corroborate this theory. Fingerprints from both Io and Daniel were found all over the house, and the signs of a violent struggle indicated that the 2 men had been involved in a physical altercation. Further investigation revealed bruises on Lydia's body consistent with being caught in the middle of a fight. It became clear to the detectives that Lydia had likely tried to intervene, attempting to calm Io and Daniel as they argued, but in the chaos she had been struck down. Whether it had been intentional or an accident was still unclear, but the result was the same: Lydia was dead, and the 2 men who had claimed to love her had destroyed her in their struggle for control. In the end, Io was arrested and charged with manslaughter, his violent outburst during the confrontation leading directly to Lydia's death. Daniel, though not charged with her murder, was placed in psychiatric care, his fragile mental state deemed too unstable for him to face trial. Kofi, Emeka, and Kwame, though deeply implicated in the emotional chaos that led to the tragedy, were not charged with any crimes, but the weight of their involvement lingered in the minds of the townspeople. The town of Salisbury was left reeling from the scandal, the tight-knit community now fractured by the knowledge that one of their own had been consumed by the dark side of love and obsession. Lydia, once the trusted nurse and beloved figure of the town, had become a tragic symbol of how easily emotional entanglements can spiral into violence. Her house, once a place of healing, now stood empty, a haunting reminder of the devastation that unchecked desires can bring. And the 5 men, each of them now bearing the scars of Lydia's death, were left to live with the consequences of their actions, forever marked by the tragedy that had unfolded in the quiet town they had once called home.